Okay, we're going to talk about John Crowe Ransom this time and a poem of his called Winter Remembered. Um, John Crowe Ransom lived between 1888 and 1974. He was a great critic as well as a poet. In fact, he may be better known. I don't really know. It's possible he's at least as well known and esteemed for his criticism and his teaching. As for his poetry, he was pretty much done writing poetry by the late 20s. I don't think he wrote too much original poetry. He may have revised some of his earlier ones, um, but most of the poetry was done by the late 20s, as I say. And he was with a group of other poets and scholars like Robert Penn Warren, Cleanth Brooks, Alan Tate, others, really responsible for reviving Southern literature in the early decades of the 20th century. They were collectively called the Fugitives for a while, and they had a magazine called The Fugitive that was short-lived, but focused on modern poetry and published a lot of Southern poets at the time, and some others like Hart Crane and what have you. Um, Out of that came the new criticism. These guys were all associated with that as well, and that's a mode of criticism that focuses on the poem as a poem or a piece of art as a piece of art, and on its formal qualities rather than, I mean, to the exclusion, in fact, of seeing it as any kind of political or philosophical statement or any kind of sociological statement, etc. They didn't really want to look at anything outside of the poem itself, and I think they gave a needed and welcome focus on the formal elements of poetry. I think that's the thing that people very frequently um, don't give enough emphasis to as we try to figure out what its meaning is, what it's saying, etc. They went probably too far. I was a little myopic about that because um, every piece of art is, in some sense, a response, and sometimes explicitly so, to things outside of the artist, things outside of the work of art, and it's not necessarily the avenue to the richest experience with it to exclude that from view. The other thing they're known for was the Southern agrarian movement. They felt that they strongly disliked modern industrial society. They considered it dehumanizing and cutting people off from sources of meaning and value that they had in an agrarian environment. You had a more a better relation to art, to religion, morality, um, all these things in an agrarian state than in the modern industrial world in big cities with alienated, deracinated individuals living in where apartment warehouses and whatnot. Um, and they wrote things about it. There was a book of essays by them whose title escapes me at the moment that advocated for this. And there's even a book um, by Crowe Ransom that was in manuscript. I think he didn't publish it during his lifetime. I think it appeared just in the last several years. It's called Land! Exclamation point, Land! And he lays out his vision in that for this for a more agrarian economy and society in America, even now, even in the 20th century. Is now, that is. And I haven't read that book, but in a way I'm surprised I haven't, because it has just the savor of quaint irrelevance and hopeless defiance that I sometimes find irresistible. And I think these kinds of things are, books that are eccentric like that can be very stimulating and make you stop you taking for granted things that you take for granted. So anyway, I imagine before I pack it in, I will read Land. In the meantime, we're going to read Winter Remembered by Crowe Ransom. I'll put the text of this in the description, whatever, that's attached to this. You can also find it online. You could go to poetry.org and find it, but it's a different version. It's a shorter version, and I don't like it quite as much. So I'm going to go with the original version, which I got in this nice book, Selected Poems, John Crowe Ransom, which I picked up last summer in a bookstore in Oxford, Mississippi, where I happen to be. I always wanted to go there to see Faulkner's home and whatnot. And in a bookstore on the square in Oxford, the square that figured into the many of Faulkner's fictions, I found this nice book. So here we go. Winter Remembered. Two evils, monstrous, either one apart, possessed me, and were long and loath at going. A cry of absence, absence in the heart, and in the wood the furious winter blowing. Think not when fire was bright upon my bricks, and past the tight boards hardly a wind could enter. I glowed like them, the simple burning sticks, far from my cause, my proper heat and center. Better to walk forth in the frozen air and wash my wounds in the snows. That would be healing, because my heart would throb less painful there, being caked with cold and past the smart of feeling. And where I walked, the murderous winter blast would have this body bowed, these eyeballs streaming. And though I think this heart's blood froze not fast, it ran too small to spare one drop for dreaming. Dear love, these fingers that had known your touch and tied our separate forces first together were 10 poor idiot fingers not worth much, 10 frozen parsnips hanging in the weather. Okay, well, I like that very much. So what we have here is, in one sense, a kind of an anecdote, something remembered. The title of the poem is Winter Remembered. A particular moment during a period in which the speaker of the poem is apparently struggling with the pain of separation from his beloved object, and whether because the relationship has ended irrevocably or whether circumstances have caused them to be separated from each other for a time, and he just misses her so terribly that he's in tremendous despair. The poem isn't specific about that, but the mood seems to suggest a love irretrievably lost. I guess that's definitely the feeling I get from it. It is so, to talk of it formally, to be good new critics here. It's symmetrical in shape. It's regular in its rhymes and rhythms. I would say it's formally impeccable. It's formal. It's you've got 5 quatrains. The rhymes are A B A B. So the first and third lines rhyme in each of the quatrains. The first and third lines rhyme, and the second and fourth lines rhyme. It's the meter is it's sort of pentameter. It's around 10. Many of the lines are 10 syllables, but some are 11, some are 12. But the hovering norm there seems to me to be the pentameter. um, it's formal too, I would say, in tone, in phrasing, in its language. There's little here that suggests ordinary speech. I wouldn't say that it's conversational in phrasing. I'm sure neither would you. There's something formal, as I say, or elevated about the diction. Thinking of phrases like long and loath at going, which is not something you hear people say a lot. Although for the past week I've been trying to work it into my ordinary conversation, but I haven't managed to do that yet. Though the sense of the speaker's pain is quite evident, I think one also perceives some restraint in the expression of it. He's not giving full, unfiltered vent to his pain. This is not a cry of pain, or he seems to be trying to give some shape to it, and to maintain some kind of decorum, if I can put it that way. In fact, on subsequent readings, that tension seemed to me to be one of the sources of the emotional wallop of the poem, and I think it has a considerable one. This kind of sense of holding it together, trying to hold it together um, in the face of tremendous pain. So, looking at that first stanza, two evils, monstrous, either one apart. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Two evils, monstrous, either one apart, possessed me, and were long and loath at going. A cry of absence, absence in the heart, and in the wood the furious winter blowing. So these two evils are assailing him at the same time. They're joined together in this moment and in this place. Um, and so they're brought into a relation here. They share a time and place. They um, condition or constitute this moment in our subject's existence. So the question is, what kind of relation subsists between these two evils? Is there in his mind and experience a a thoroughgoing affinity between them, um, or is one in some sense a foil for the other? Are they to be contrasted with each other? Um, do they illuminate each other by their likeness or by their difference? Is there and it's some kind of continuum between inner and outer that makes them kind of one complex of feeling, or not? Um, one of these evils possesses his inner being, his heart, you might say. Um, the other, his body, the external conditions, the harsh winter conditions. What they have in common, therefore, is that they both possess him, and that both were, that lovely phrase again, long and loath at going. Um, but though these two evils are joined at this moment, he what's interesting in this first stanza, I think, is that he makes a clear and definite point about there being separate things, and that one can experience either of them without the other. Um, that's not in itself a terribly interesting idea. It's not that we don't already know that we could um, be experiencing the pain of a lost love, without there being terrible winter conditions at the same time, or and vice versa. And it's not that. I think what's interesting is that he decides within the fairly small compass of a 5 quatrain poem to make a point of their independence from each other. I mean, I think that's interesting. I think it's kind of a clue that, actually, in retrospect, looking back on it, I don't think I picked up on this at all the first time through. But it's a clue that we're not going to go down a certain kind of path with this, or employ a certain trope that we might be conditioned to expect. We're not necessarily to take the harsh winter conditions as an external manifestation of his inner despair, a reflection of it. He's not necessarily projecting his pain upon his physical environment. He's not reading his pain into it, um, or he's not taking it as some kind of cosmic substantiation of the hopelessness that he's struggling with. Um, he's not connecting the inner and the outer. He's not seeing the physical environment that he's in, the world outside of himself, as of a piece with his inner despair. So, and neither should we. And as in contrast with that, as you've probably seen before in any number of poems, um, we did see something of that in the post. If you happen to see the post I did on Thomas Hardy's "The Darkling Thrush," that was in December, I think. You'd have seen something of that in that poem. The speaker in that poem is not mourning a lost love. It's more general existential anxiety, I guess, that is oppressing and transfixing him there. But the external conditions in that one constitute and functioning as a trope, an external manifestation of his thoughts and his emotional state. And that's not what's really happening here. He seems to be so the poem seems to be preparing the reader not to see these two evils as forming a continuum between the inner and the outer, We have a more complicated relationship, maybe a more ambiguous relationship. Um, they're joined in time and place, but they're separate. He's he's insisting on that. I would say. So, and then looking again at it formally, you look at the alternating rhymes that occur in this quatrain, and when you find alternating rhymes in a quatrain, an A B sequence, that of course draws lines 1 and 3 together and lines 2 and 4 together as as an auditory phenomenon. Um, but in another way, it also looked at in another way. It draws lines 1 and 2 together and lines 3 and 4 together. Um, since in the latter case, they can be seen as constituting that lines 1 and 2 and lines 3 and 4 can be seen as constituting two units, the second of which echoes the first. Um, so for example, um, apart and going is echoed by heart and blowing. Lines 1 and 2, apart and going, heart and blowing. So, so focusing on the two units as uh, 1 and 3 and 2 and 4, apart, heart, going, blowing, um, separates the two evils because they're not in the same. They're not uh, in the same unit. But if you look at the other way, um, where the relevant units are 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, then they're brought together. So the rhyming dynamic kind of enacts the speaker's experience of these two evils as both separate and joined, joined in time as a matter, really as a matter of happenstance, of accident, not destiny or anything like that, but but separate in essence. So this dynamic, or maybe a dialectic is the word for it, between them being separate and them being joined, is reflected and underlined in the way that the stanza is formally constructed. At least I think so. Maybe I'm pressing that point too much, but I don't think so. So in fact, so far from asserting or evoking a continuity between the inner and the outer landscapes, um, a trope emerges that depicts their disconnection in a certain way. So the next stanza goes, "Think not when fire," and he said he starts it with "think not." He's kind of you know if he's telling you in the first stanza, giving you clues not to go down a certain path and not think of it in a certain way, and then he begins the second one, "Think not." He's still he's still doing the same thing. "Think not when fire was bright upon my bricks, and past the tight boards hardly a wind could enter. I glowed like them, the simple burning sticks, far from my cause, my proper heat and center." So, um, so we have this other trope coming into play here, and another one that we sometimes see in poems about the pain of lost love, and that we did see. In fact, if you think about another post, the Spencer sonnet that I talked about some months back, you saw it there too, where um, this pain of that he's experiencing by losing his love, and the despair and the hopelessness that it plunges him into, is something that is kind of outside of nature, or it it takes him to a place that he can't assimilate into any sort of coherent conception of nature, and that figures in the poems in tropes where natural forces, natural phenomena are depicted, but not doing what we normally expect them to do. Often they're doing what exactly the opposite of what we expect them to do. And I think in the Spencer sonnet, we had fire, and ice were prominent in that poem, and ice was burning, and the fire was quenching or cooling. I can't remember exactly, but it was nature was subverted and perverted in this trope, and that served as a way of capturing the, the place to which the speaker of the poem had been taken in his emotions with this, with the what he's uh, struggling with, his that being his lost love. So um, and I think in that video also I quoted from Cleanth Brooks, who was in Ransom's posse. So why not talk about that here? He's writing about Robert Penn Warren's poetry in an essay that I know, and he says, "Man is not merely natural. His capacity for defying nature is typically the human trait." I mean, I think in that in the phenomenon of love between human beings and human relations, um, you open the door to that part of man that seems to be um, outside of nature, and I think that's kind of what Brooks is getting at, and what that we seem to be part of nature, but in some ways outside of nature. Um, that even in the animal kingdom, even the animals that are monogamous and don't have the complex relationship experience of love that of course we have. It's in all likelihood much much simpler. Um, so he's in this house. I guess it's a house. I'm picturing some kind of cabin in the woods. Um, but whether that's true or not, he's in a house and he cannot be. The fire's going and it can't warm him. So it's a similar kind of thing. He's there's a he's frozen at his core in his deepest emotional core, and the fire is just impotent in the face of that. Um, he calls his absent love his cause, and we notice that the normal cause and effect of the natural world seems suspended in that sense. Again, as a trope, no one would not literally expect a fire to despair is not literally frozenness, and fire wouldn't do that, but it uh, wouldn't warm it. Uh, so it's functioning as a trope, but it's there's also the affective dimension of you think of the fireplace of the hearth. It isn't only physical warmth, but also it's emotional warmth that's associated with it, safety, belonging, etc. Um, um, okay, so then the next stanza: "Better to walk forth in the frozen air and wash my wounds in the snows. That would be healing, because my heart would throb less painful there, being caked with cold and past the smart of feeling." So more subversion of natural expectations. He this washing wounds in the snows and hearts being caked with ice, and this being the way to at least numb himself from feeling. It is it suggests that there is this. If you expected there to be some kind of connection between his inner landscape and the outer landscape, it's more complicated. It's more ambiguous than that, um, and that's quite an image there. The heart, being caked with cold past the smart of feeling. His heart would throb less painful there. And where he walks, the murderous winter snow. I'm sorry, winter blast would have this body bowed, these eyeballs streaming. And though I think this heart's blood froze not fast, it ran too small to spare one drop for dreaming. So that's more of the same idea. He's out in the winter conditions, and um, he's he's benumbed by them, and his blood didn't freeze fast, which would of course kill him. But it's running too small to. It's not. It's he's too numb to actually feel the pain that he's been experiencing because of his the end of his love. Um, that these eyeballs streaming line really jumps out at me there, because of course that's what happens when you cry, but he's not crying. It's that familiar phenomenon that anybody who lives in a place where there's an actual winter, when you're outside, it'll make your eyes tear. You'll look like you're crying, but you're not crying. And then he's he comes to the last stanza, and he directly addresses his absent love. He says, "Dear love, these fingers that had known your touch and tied our separate forces together were 10 poor idiot fingers not worth much, 10 frozen parsnips hanging in the weather." Um, so that separate and together dialectic kind of returns here. He's that was first sounded in the first stanza. He's talking about his fingers as both being separate and as being able to come together and draw draw themselves together and help draw his and her separate forces together. But they, in the end, as things have fallen out, they're 10 poor idiot fingers not worth much. They're separate and isolated and not worth much. 10 frozen parsnips hanging in the weather, and that's quite an image for um, the reality of what has happened versus what he surely would have hoped would have happened with the woman. Um, and and so there you have it. That's the poem. I think there's a lot there to explore further. I think I'm just trying to open some seams, if possible. I think one can. I've been having a nice time over the past couple of weeks, just having it in my head and turning it over and over and over. And I think this poem would definitely reward that that effort. And so I hope you like it, and I'll read it again, and we'll close this one out. Winter remembered. Two evils, monstrous either one apart, possessed me and were long and loath at going. A cry of absence, absence in the heart, and in the woods the furious winter blowing. Think not when fire was bright upon my bricks, and past the tight boards hardly a wind could enter, I glowed like them, the simple burning sticks, far from my cause, my proper heat and center. Better to walk forth in the frozen air and wash my wound in the snows. That would be healing, because my heart would throb less painful there, being caked with cold and past the smart of feeling. And where I walked, the murderous winter blast would have this body bowed, these eyeballs streaming. And though I think this heart's blood froze not fast, it ran too small to spare one drop for dreaming. Dear love, these fingers that had known your touch and tied our separate forces to get first together were 10 poor idiot fingers not worth much, 10 frozen parsnips hanging in the weather. And one thing I didn't touch on, but you should pay attention to, is the where the stresses fall in the poem. It begins with the first two stanzas begin with a spondee, two evils, monsters either one apart. So the two evils, you have two stress syllables, two, and then the first syllable of evils. And then in the next one, think not. That's a spondee also, two stress syllables. And there's a lot of spondees and trochees. And spondees, of course, are two stress syllables. A poetic foot with two stress syllables. A trochee is one where the first syllable is stressed. Um, they seem to be dominating here. I didn't go through it painstakingly and mark all that out, but I would say that they're dominating here, and it gives the poem a sound, a kind of drum beat that that I mean significantly enhances the feeling that it generates. So that's something to pay attention to also. Okay, so that's John Crowe Ransom. That's Winter Remembered. And next time, I think I'm gonna do a poem by Leroy Jones, who later became Amiri Baraka. Um, I've been looking at a couple that I like and I think would be nice to look at. So I think that's what's going to happen next time. In the meantime, um, subscribe if you haven't. Why not? Why not? And if you like poetry, if you have any thoughts about the poem, if you have any thoughts about what I'm doing, if you have any constructive ideas, I'm open to those too. Please add them to the comments. And with that, I will say goodbye and see you next time.